Cary Grant and Randolph Scott lived together for 12 years. They shared a house, they shared a life, and the photos showed they were happy. To the studio, Bachelor Hall wasn't a home, it was a ticking time bomb. When rumors threatened profits, executives weaponized marriage, forcing both men into unions with strangers to dismantle their partnership. It was a brutal calculation: destroy the relationship to save the asset. Before he was Cary Grant, the epitome of sophisticated charm, he was merely a ghost haunting the damp industrial streets of Bristol, England. His name was Archie Leech, born in 1904 into a childhood defined not by love, but by a chilling, pervasive silence. The desperate need for connection he would later find in Hollywood began here with a boy who was convinced he was unlovable. Archie's world shattered when he was just 11 years old. He came home from school one day to an empty house. The silence was deafening. When he asked for his mother, his father, a cold, heavy-drinking man, told him a lie that would scar him for decades. He said she had gone away to a seaside resort. Later, he changed the story. She was dead. The truth was far more horrific. His mother hadn't died, and she hadn't left him willingly. She had been committed to a grim mental institution, the country home for mental defectives, locked away by his own father. But Archie didn't know this. For 20 years, he lived with the crushing belief that his mother had simply chosen to leave him. He internalized a brutal lesson. If the person who gave you life can abandon you, anyone can. Desperate to escape the suffocation of his home life, Archie ran away. He didn't run to a new family. He ran to the circus. He joined the Bob Pender troupe of acrobats, learning to walk on stilts and tumble across the stage. It was here, amidst the grease paint and the applause, that he made a life-altering discovery. People liked him when he performed. If he smiled bright enough, if he moved gracefully enough, nobody could see the broken boy underneath. This was the birth of the mask. When Archie eventually crossed the Atlantic to America, he decided that Archie Leech was too sad, too poor, and too damaged to survive. He began to construct a new skin. He studied the wealthy, mimicked their accents, and practiced a walk that projected effortless confidence. He invented Cary Grant, not as a career move, but as a survival mechanism. By the time he arrived in Hollywood in the early 1930s, the transformation was physically complete, but psychologically brittle. Cary Grant was a dazzling suit of armor, polished to perfection, but inside that armor, Archie Leech was still shivering, terrified of being found out, and terrified of being alone. He was a man who could charm the world, yet he couldn't stand the silence of an empty room. He was waiting for someone who wouldn't be fooled by the performance. He was waiting for Randolph Scott. If Archie Leech was a man running away from a nightmare, Randolph Scott was a man walking confidently toward a dream. Born in 1898 in the rolling hills of Orange County, Virginia, Randolph, or Randy to those who knew him, was everything Archie was not. He was the product of stability, wealth, and deep ancestral roots. He didn't need to invent a persona because he was born with one. He was American aristocracy, a Southern gentleman raised with the certainty of knowing exactly who he was and where he belonged. While Archie was tumbling on cold stages in England for scraps of food, Randy was attending private schools and studying engineering at the University of North Carolina. But there was a steel beneath that polite Southern drawl. In 1917, when the world went to war, Randy didn't hide. He lied about his age to enlist. Serving as an artillery observer in France during World War I, he had seen the muddy reality of the trenches, the true face of life and death. This experience gave him a grounded perspective that was rare in the frivolous world of show business. When he eventually arrived in Los Angeles, he didn't come with the desperate hunger of a starving artist. He came with the relaxed stride of a man on an adventure. Hollywood often tries to manufacture the strong, silent type, but Randolph Scott was the genuine article. He was physically imposing, tall, tanned, and athletic, with a face that looked like it belonged on a coin. He radiated a sun-drenched confidence that couldn't be taught in acting class. He was comfortable in his own skin, a luxury that the neurotic and anxious Cary Grant could only dream of possessing. Randy wasn't looking for someone to complete him. He was already whole. But beneath that conventional, conservative exterior lay a spirit that yearned for something more than the rigid expectations of Virginia society. He wanted freedom. He wanted a life that was his own. When he walked onto the Paramount lot, he was an anchor waiting for a ship. He was the rock, steady, unshakable, and warm. He was the precise antidote to the chaos swirling inside Cary Grant's mind. Fate was about to bring the nervous acrobat and the steady soldier together, proving that in physics and in love, opposites don't just attract, they stabilize one another. The year was 1932. The setting was the Paramount Studios commissary, a chaotic, high-ceilinged cafeteria where Roman centurions ate sandwiches next to flappers and cowboys. It was the epicenter of the industry, a place buzzing with ambition and anxiety. Amidst the noise, Cary Grant sat alone. He was a newcomer, still trying to make his manufactured persona fit, nursing a coffee and looking every bit the nervous Englishman in a suit that was slightly too tight. Then Randolph Scott walked in. By all accounts, the meeting wasn't dramatic, but the chemistry was instantaneous. Randy, already somewhat established and moving with that signature cowboy swagger, spotted the solitary young actor. He didn't see Cary Grant, the next big thing. He saw Archie Leech, a man who looked like he was waiting for a firing squad. With the casual hospitality of a Southerner, Randy walked over, pulled out a chair, and sat down. In that noisy cafeteria, the connection was electric. It wasn't just that they were both handsome. It was that they offered each other exactly what the other was missing. Cary was manic, quick-witted, and fragile. Randy was slow-talking, deeply grounded, and strong. For Cary, who had spent his life performing for survival, Randy's presence was like taking a deep breath after holding it for years. For Randy, accustomed to the rough edges of the oil fields and the trenches, Cary's refined sensitivity was fascinating. They didn't talk about box office numbers or contract disputes. They talked about the things that actually mattered: the loneliness of a new city, the absurdity of the movie business, the desire for a place that felt like a real home. They laughed, and for a moment the artifice of the studio lot faded away, but they weren't the only ones watching. Across the room, studio executives and publicists took note. In Hollywood, nothing is sacred. Everything is an asset. They didn't see a budding romance or a profound friendship. They saw a marketing goldmine. Two gorgeous, unmarried men radiating charisma. It was a hook. A studio insider reportedly whispered that the combination of Grant's sophisticated charm and Scott's rugged masculinity was dynamite. Paramount didn't try to separate them. In fact, they did the opposite. They saw the spark, and they decided to pour gasoline on it. If these two wanted to be close, the studio reasoned, why not let them? It would save on rent, and more importantly, it would sell tickets. The collision had happened, and Bachelor Hall was about to be born. If the meeting in the Paramount commissary was the spark, the house at 2177 West Live Oak Drive was the fireplace where that fire was allowed to burn, warm, and steady. In 1932, shortly after their fateful collision, Cary Grant and Randolph Scott made a decision that would baffle the traditionalists of Hollywood and delight the gossip columnists. They decided to move in together. They didn't choose a bachelor pad in the heart of the city's Vice District, nor did they retreat to a rugged ranch miles from civilization. They chose a sprawling, multi-level Spanish colonial revival mansion, perched high in the Los Feliz hills. It was a place of architectural beauty, with white stucco walls that caught the California sun and red clay tiles that spoke of old-world charm. But more than its aesthetic appeal, the house offered something that Archie Leech had been craving his entire life, and Randolph Scott valued above all else: privacy. Perched on the hillside, the house, which they would famously christen Bachelor Hall, felt like a fortress. It looked down upon the sprawling grid of Los Angeles, a city of neon lights and desperate ambition, while remaining removed from it. Up there, the air was cleaner, smelling of jasmine and eucalyptus. Up there, the noise of the studio lot, the shouting of directors, and the prying eyes of producers faded into a distant hum. To enter Bachelor Hall was to step out of the performative arena of Hollywood and into a sanctuary where the masks could finally be taken off. For Randolph Scott, the move was a practical extension of his personality. He was a man who appreciated structure and sensible economics. Why live alone in a hollow mansion when you could share the costs and the company with someone you trusted? It was a logical, grounded decision typical of the Virginian gentleman. But for Cary Grant, or rather for the wounded Archie Leech hiding inside him, this house was nothing short of a miracle, its profound psychological weight rooted deeply in the cold, empty rooms of his childhood in Bristol. He had grown up in a house where love was conditional and presence was fleeting. He had spent his teenage years sleeping in boarding houses, cheap motels, and circus tents, always living out of a suitcase, always ready to run. He had never really had a home, not in the true sense of the word. He had only had temporary shelters. Bachelor Hall changed everything. For the first time, Archie Leech unpacked his suitcase and didn't feel the urge to pack it again. He placed his books on the shelves. He hung his clothes in the closet next to Randy's. There was a permanence to the stone walls and the heavy oak furniture that soothed his anxious nervous system. The house became a physical manifestation of the safety he found in Randy. It was the first place in his adult life where he didn't have to sing for his supper or smile to keep the darkness at bay. The domestic routine they established was shockingly, beautifully mundane. In a town fueled by cocaine, champagne, and midnight scandals, the life of Grant and Scott was defined by a quiet, rhythmic domesticity. They were not throwing wild parties for showgirls. They were building a life. Mornings at Bachelor Hall were a study in intimacy. Witnesses and friends who visited the house often remarked on the natural, unforced dynamic between the two men. They didn't act like roommates who merely shared a roof. They moved around each other with the synchronized grace of a long-married couple. Randy, ever the early riser, would often be up with the sun, reading the financial section of the newspaper. He was a shrewd investor, eventually becoming one of the richest men in Hollywood, while Cary would emerge later, his hair unkempt, stripping away the Cary Grant veneer to reveal the soft, sleepy-eyed Archie. They ate breakfast together, often on the patio overlooking the pool. It wasn't a performance. There were no cameras there to capture the way Randy would pour the coffee or the way Cary would read aloud a funny line from a script he was considering. It was in these small, insignificant moments that the true depth of their bond was forged. They created a private language of shared jokes, glances, and comfortable silences, the kind of silence that only exists between two people who are completely at ease with one another. The house itself seemed designed to nurture this closeness. The centerpiece of their social world was the swimming pool. In the 1930s, the California sun was a health craze and a tan was a symbol of vitality. But for Cary and Randy, the pool was their playground. They spent hours there, swimming laps, sunbathing on the terracotta tiles, or simply floating in the water talking about everything and nothing. It is important to note the distinct lack of live-in staff at night. In an era where stars of their magnitude would typically have a small army of cooks, maids, and butlers, catering to their every whim 24 hours a day, Grant and Scott were notoriously frugal and notoriously private. They had staff during the day to clean and maintain the grounds, but when the sun went down, the staff was sent home. The gates were closed. The phone was often taken off the hook. This exclusion of outsiders was deliberate. Inside the walls of Bachelor Hall, they didn't have to worry about a maid selling a story to a tabloid or a butler misinterpreting a gesture. They could be themselves. They cooked simple dinners for each other. Cary was known to be a decent cook, often making comfort foods that reminded him of England, while Randy preferred hearty American fare. They would sit by the fireplace in the living room, Randy nursing a scotch, Cary perhaps with a glass of wine, and they would simply be. For Cary, this domesticity was healing. The anxiety that plagued him, the constant humming fear that he wasn't good enough, that he was a fraud, would dissipate in Randy's presence. Randy was the anchor. If Cary began to spiral, worrying about a bad review or a wrinkle on his forehead, Randy's calm, deep voice would pull him back to earth. Randy offered a masculine stability that Archie's father had never provided. In return, Cary brought light, wit, and a frantic, joyful energy into Randy's somewhat stoic world. They balanced the scales for one another. Friends who visited the house, eccentrics like Carol Lombard or the witty writers of the time, sensed the unique atmosphere of the place. It wasn't a frat house. It didn't smell of stale beer and locker room talk. It was elegant. It was warm. It was, in every sense that mattered, a marital home. The furniture was chosen with care. The art on the walls was a blend of their tastes. Even their dogs, they were avid dog lovers, were raised together, creating a complete family unit. At this point in time, Hollywood was still somewhat tolerant of eccentricity, provided it remained profitable. The industry knew about Bachelor Hall. The executives at Paramount knew, the directors knew, but in 1932 and 1933, nobody saw it as a threat. They saw two young men saving money. They saw a quirky living arrangement. Or perhaps they saw exactly what it was, a love story, and simply didn't care as long as the box office returns were high. But therein lay the paradox that would eventually destroy them. The very beauty of Bachelor Hall, its photogenic perfection, its two handsome inhabitants, its aura of health and vitality, was exactly what made it so tempting to the studio's publicity department. Cary and Randy thought they had built a fortress to keep the world out. They didn't realize that they had actually built a stage. The walls of Bachelor Hall were high, but they were not opaque. The happiness radiating from 2177 West Live Oak Drive was too bright to be ignored. It was a commodity. And Paramount Pictures, struggling through the Great Depression and desperate for stars that could sell tickets to women, looked at the domestic bliss of Cary Grant and Randolph Scott and didn't see a sanctuary. They saw a marketing campaign. They saw the Bachelor Hall, not as a home, but as a brand. And they were about to ask the two men to open the doors and let the cameras in. The tragedy wasn't that the studio discovered their secret. The tragedy was that the studio decided to sell it. The sanctuary was about to become a showroom, and the private love that healed Archie Leech was about to be packaged for mass consumption. The tragedy that eventually befell them was driven not by fate, but by the cynicism of the machine that controlled them. In 1933, Hollywood was not merely an entertainment capital. It was the only industry in America that seemed immune to the Great Depression. Outside the gates of Paramount Studios, the country was on its knees. Bread lines stretched for blocks in major cities. Unemployment was sky high, and the average American man felt stripped of his dignity and his ability to provide. Inside the gates, however, the business of dreams was booming. The public, crushed by the grim reality of economic collapse, was desperate for escapism. They didn't want realism, they wanted fantasy. They wanted to see beautiful people living in beautiful houses, wearing silk and drinking champagne untouched by the dust and despair of the real world. Paramount Pictures, like every other major studio, understood that their survival depended on manufacturing these fantasies with industrial precision. And in 1933, they realized they had a unique product in their inventory, the domestic bliss of Cary Grant and Randolph Scott. It began in the smoke-filled boardrooms of the publicity department. The executives faced a specific challenge with their two rising stars. Randolph Scott was the rugged American archetype, but he lacked the dangerous sexual edge of a Clark Gable. Cary Grant was the sophisticated newcomer, but his elegance could be misconstrued as aloofness or worse, effeminacy. Individually, they were marketable, but together they were a phenomenon. The studio strategists saw an opportunity to create a new kind of narrative. They wouldn't market Grant and Scott as lonely bachelors prowling for women. That image was too predatory, too threatening to the family values that the studio claimed to uphold. Nor would they market them as settled down. That would alienate the millions of female fans who bought tickets precisely because they could fantasize about being the one to tame these stars. Instead, Paramount invented a third option, the happy bachelors. They decided to market the lifestyle at Bachelor Hall as the ultimate aspirational fantasy. It was a masterstroke of branding. By framing Grant and Scott as inseparable roommates, the studio achieved a perfect balance. They were available, technically single, yet domesticated, living a quiet, stable life. They were masculine, athletic, strong, yet safe. They weren't seen stumbling out of brothels or causing public scandals with married women. This is where the metaphor of the faucet becomes crucial. This was not a case of the press uncovering a secret against the studio's will. This was the studio deliberately reaching out and turning the handle of publicity wide open. They didn't just allow the narrative of Grant and Scott's cohabitation. They actively wrote the script for it. Paramount's publicity machine began to feed the fan magazines, Photoplay, Modern Screen, Silver Screen, with curated tidbits about life at 2177 West Live Oak Drive. They issued press releases that sounded more like breathless diary entries than professional announcements. Cary and Randy are the best of friends, the columns would read. They share everything, expenses, clothes, and dreams. The studio encouraged them to appear together at premieres, not just as colleagues, but as a unit. When the cameras flashed on the red carpet, they weren't standing awkwardly apart. They were shoulder to shoulder, grinning, comfortable in each other's space. The studio promoted this intimacy because it sold tickets for their films. When they starred together in Hot Saturday, 1932, and The Eagle and the Hawk, 1933, the box office returns confirmed the executives' theory. The audience loved the chemistry. They loved the idea of this deep, unbreakable bond between two handsome men. It was a strange, paradoxical time in American culture. The term homosexuality was clinical, dark, and largely unspoken in polite society. It was associated with the underground, with deviance, with crime. Because of this, the general public had no frame of reference for what they were seeing. To the average moviegoer in 1933, Two men living together and sharing a life didn't signal gay. It signaled fraternity. It signaled buddyhood. It was viewed through a lens of innocence that seems almost impossible to comprehend today. Cary and Randy, for their part, played the game willingly. In fact, they likely viewed this publicity strategy as the ultimate camouflage. It was a classic case of hiding in plain sight. By being so open about their living situation, by inviting the world to look at their front door, they deflected suspicion. If they were truly hiding a forbidden love, the logic went, they would never be this public about it. The openness was the disguise. Cary, with his sharp instinct for survival, embraced the narrative. He gave interviews where he gushed about Randy. "Randy is the rock I cling to," he would say, or variations of that sentiment. He wasn't lying. He was telling the absolute truth, but he knew the public would interpret it as the hyperbolic praise of a loyal friend, not the confession of a lover. He was feeding the machine exactly what it wanted, believing he could control the output. The studio even monetized the economics of their relationship. In the midst of the Depression, the narrative of two thrifty bachelors sharing rent played well with the struggling public. It made these astronomical stars seem relatable. "Look," the studio whispered, "even Cary Grant and Randolph Scott have to watch their pennies." It was a brilliant, manipulative lie. Grant and Scott were already incredibly wealthy men who could have afforded 10 mansions each. They weren't sharing a house to save money. They were sharing a house because they couldn't bear to be apart. But the thrift angle gave the studio a plausible, socially acceptable excuse for their cohabitation. The open faucet period was a golden era of profitability. The fan mail poured into Paramount. Women wrote letters begging for the address of Bachelor Hall, dreaming of being the woman who could finally break up the duo. Men wrote letters asking for their workout routines, admiring their health and vitality. The studio was making money hand over fist on the Grant Scott brand. But in their greed, the studio executives failed to see the cliff edge they were approaching. They were selling intimacy. They were selling the image of two men who were completely self-sufficient, who found their primary emotional satisfaction in each other. They were, without realizing it, marketing a queer domestic idol to mainstream America. They were conditioning the audience to see Grant and Scott as a couple. And while that was profitable in 1933, the cultural tides were shifting. The pre-code era of Hollywood, a time of relative moral looseness, was coming to an end. The Hays Code, a rigid set of moral censorship guidelines, was gaining teeth. The studio had turned the faucet on full blast, delighting in the flow of cash, unaware that the water was slowly rising around them. They had created a spectacle that was about to become too real, too visible, and too undeniable for the puritanical forces gathering on the horizon. Cary Grant and Randolph Scott were just living their lives, thinking they had found the perfect balance between their careers and their hearts. They didn't realize that by letting the studio turn their love into a product, they had handed over the ownership of their relationship. The studio had built the pedestal they stood on, and soon the studio would decide it was time to kick it out from under them. It happened on a bright, cloudless morning in the summer of 1934. A photographer named Ben English, commissioned by Paramount Studios and Modern Screen magazine, drove his car up the winding roads of the Hollywood Hills. He pulled into the driveway of 2177 West Live Oak Drive with a trunk full of camera equipment, flash bulbs, and a mandate from the studio publicity department. Capture the boys at home, make it warm, make it enviable. Cary Grant and Randolph Scott greeted him at the door. They were tanned, fit, and disarmingly relaxed. To them, this wasn't an interrogation, it was a victory lap. They were the kings of the lot, their movies were hits, and they were proud of the home they had built together. In their minds, they were simply inviting the world to see how well they lived. They didn't realize they were inviting the executioner to take measurements for the gallows. The photo shoot that followed is perhaps the most fascinating document of LGBTQ plus history in Hollywood, precisely because it wasn't stolen by a paparazzi hiding in the bushes. It was staged, lit, and directed by the studio itself. It was a sanctioned exposure of a relationship that would, only a few years later, be deemed a moral crime. Ben English set up his tripod, and the performance of domesticity began. But looking at the contact sheets nearly a century later, what strikes the viewer is the lack of performance. The studio likely gave them the direction to act natural, and disastrously, beautifully, they did exactly that. The resulting images were a catalog of intimacy. In one iconic shot, Cary stands at the stove, wearing an apron over his impeccable trousers, stirring a pot. Randy stands next to him at the sink, drying dishes with a towel, smiling at something Cary has just said. It is a scene of profound marital normalcy. There is no posturing, no attempt to look tough. It is simply two people sharing the labor of a life together. In another sequence, they are on the diving board of the pool. Randy, in swimming trunks, is poised to dive. Cary is playfully pushing him, hands on Randy's waist, laughter frozen on both their faces. The physical contact is constant. Hands on shoulders, knees touching while sitting on the patio furniture, leaning in to read the same newspaper. The concept of personal space, usually so rigidly guarded by heterosexual men of that era, does not exist between them. The photographer moved them through the house, capturing them in the bedroom, the living room, the garden, in a shot that would later baffle historians with its boldness. They are pictured having breakfast. The table is set for two. They are wearing robes. They look like any couple on a Sunday morning, sleepy and content, sharing toast and coffee. Why did the studio allow this? Why did they commission photos that, to a modern eye, scream lovers? The answer lies in the specific blindness of the 1930s. To the studio executives, these images didn't look like a gay romance because a gay romance was, in their worldview, an impossibility for men like Grant and Scott. Homosexuality was associated with the effeminate, the shadows, the pansy caricatures. It wasn't associated with the sun-drenched, athletic, all-American bodies of their leading men. The studio looked at these photos and saw fraternity. They saw a modernized version of a college dorm. They saw two thrifty bachelors enjoying the single life. They failed to see the softness in Cary's eyes when he looked at Randy. They failed to see the protective arch of Randy's body when he stood next to Cary. They saw the props, the aprons, the toaster, the newspaper, but missed the subtext. However, there was a deeper, more subversive element at play in these photos, one that would eventually trigger the backlash. By photographing Cary Grant in an apron and Randolph Scott drying dishes, the studio had accidentally disrupted the rigid gender roles of the time. Here were two he-men, two idols of masculinity, performing women's work. In 1934, a man's place was in the office or the factory. The kitchen was the woman's domain. By showing two men running a household without the presence of a woman, the photos implicitly suggested that women were unnecessary for their happiness. They were self-sufficient emotionally and domestically. That was the dangerous signal. It wasn't just that they were sleeping together. It was that they didn't need anyone else. When the session wrapped, Ben English packed up his gear. Cary and Randy likely shook his hand, offered him a drink, and watched him drive away feeling satisfied. They had played the game. They had given the studio the content it wanted. The photos were published in Modern Screen under the title A Gay Bachelor Life, using the word gay in its 1930s definition of carefree and happy. The article described their perfect understanding and their shared domestic bliss. The magazine hit the newsstands across America. Millions of copies were sold. Housewives in the Midwest taped the photos to their walls, dreaming of finding a husband as handsome as Cary or as strong as Randy. Men looked at the photos and envied their freedom. But in the dark corners of the industry and in the offices of the newly strengthened moral censorship boards, the photos landed with a thud. The sheer volume of the images, the undeniable intimacy of them, began to shift the conversation. It was too much. It was too real. The open faucet had flooded the room. What was meant to be a publicity coup became visual evidence. These photographs, taken with the studio's blessing, would soon become the very weapon used to blackmail them. The Catholic Legion of Decency was forming. The Hays Office, which enforced the motion picture production code, was gaining teeth. The studio realized they had made a miscalculation. They had marketed Grant and Scott as a package deal to double the profits. But now that package was becoming toxic, the happy bachelor's narrative had a shelf life, and it had expired. A man of 30 living with his best friend was charming. A man of 35 doing the same was suspicious. The studio publicists, the same people who had sent the photographer to Bachelor Hall just months earlier, now began to change their tune. They stopped issuing press releases about the boys' shared dinners. They started planting stories about their dates with starlets. They manufactured romances with actresses who were also under contract, orchestrating candid photos of Cary and Randy at nightclubs with women on their arms. But the chemistry was never the same. In the photos with women, Cary looked stiff, his smile practiced. In the photos with Randy, he looked alive. The public, though not yet fully aware of the truth, could sense the difference. The whispers grew louder. The jokes became crueler. The term Bachelor Hall began to take on a double meaning in the industry. It was no longer a symbol of enviable freedom, but a euphemism for a house of secrets. The faucet of publicity, which had flowed so freely with images of their love, was about to be wrenched shut. The studio executives convened a meeting. The topic was no longer how to sell Cary Grant and Randolph Scott as a duo. The topic was how to separate them before they dragged the studio's reputation down with them. The era of the open door was over. The era of the fixers had begun. The year 1934 marked a seismic shift in the American cultural landscape. It was the year the party ended. If the early 1930s had been a period of relative permissiveness, a pre-code era, where Hollywood flirted with sin, scandal, and moral ambiguity, mid-1934 was the moment the lights were turned on, the music was cut, and the police kicked down the door. To understand why the sanctuary of Bachelor Hall had to be destroyed, one must look beyond the personal lives of Cary Grant and Randolph Scott and stare directly into the face of the force that was coming for them, the motion picture production code, enforced by the newly empowered Joseph Breen. For years, the Hays Code, named after Will H. Hays, had existed on paper, a toothless tiger that studio heads largely ignored. They viewed moral guidelines as suggestions, not laws. But in 1934, the Catholic Church, alarmed by what they perceived as the moral rot of cinema, formed the Legion of Decency. Their threat was existential. They wouldn't just boycott a single scandalous movie. They would order millions of Catholics to boycott entire studios. This was the language that Paramount understood. It was the language of bankruptcy. Joseph Breen, a stern, anti-Semitic, and deeply conservative Catholic layman, was appointed to enforce the code. He was given the power to read every script, approve every costume, and, crucially, police the off-screen lives of the stars. Breen's worldview was rigid. In his eyes, movies were not art. They were moral instruction for the masses. And in Breen's moral universe, there was no room for ambiguity, and certainly no room for the perversion of homosexuality. The code explicitly forbade the depiction of sex perversion or any inference of it. But Breen went further. He believed that the lives of the actors had to reflect the sanctity of the characters they played. You could not sell a man as a romantic hero to American housewives if he was living in sin with another man. It was a fraud that risked the wrath of the church and the collapse of the box office. For Cary Grant and Randolph Scott, the rise of Joseph Breen was a catastrophe. The very things that had made them marketable in 1932, their closeness, their domesticity, their refusal to play by the rules, were now liabilities. The atmosphere in Hollywood shifted overnight from a creative playground to a surveillance state. The studio executives at Paramount, once the cheerleaders of the Bachelor Hall brand, were now terrified. They looked at the dossier on Grant and Scott. They looked at the modern screen photos of the apron and the dishes. What was once cute now looked like evidence. Under the new regime, the happy bachelor's narrative wasn't just a quirky lifestyle choice. It was a ticking time bomb that could trigger a legion of decency boycott. The pressure began to descend from the top. Memo after memo circulated through the Paramount offices. The word effeminate became a curse. Directors were instructed to toughen up Cary Grant's on-screen persona. They told him to lower his voice, to stop using hand gestures that might be read as fey. For Randolph Scott, the pressure was to emphasize his virility, his cowboyness, to erase any trace of softness that might have rubbed off from his domestic life. But the real target was the house itself. Bachelor Hall, once the envy of Hollywood, was now viewed by the studio's legal department as a crime scene in waiting. The moral clause in every actor's contract, a standard provision that allowed studios to fire stars for conduct unbecoming, was dusted off and sharpened. Cary Grant, with his hypersensitivity to danger, felt the shift in the air before anyone else. He saw colleagues being quietly dropped. He saw the way Breen's censors looked at him on set. The ghost of the Hays Code wasn't just a set of rules. It was a pervasive fear that infiltrated every dinner party and every conversation. The studio didn't attack immediately. They started with suggestions. Publicists would casually mention to Cary that it might be good to be seen with a specific actress at the premiere. They would suggest to Randy that he spend more time at the racetrack and less time at the pool. But the bond between the two men was stubborn. They didn't want to play the game. They liked their life. They liked their home. They were, in a quiet, defiant way, resisting the New World Order. They assumed that their stardom, the millions of dollars they generated, would protect them. They were wrong. The Hays Code was not about money. It was about control. And Joseph Breen was determined to prove that no one, not even the most beautiful men in the world, was above the moral law. The open faucet was being wrenched shut by the iron hand of censorship, and the water was running dry. The time for suggestions was over. The time for orders was about to begin. The summons did not come with the usual fanfare. There were no friendly slaps on the back from assistant directors, no invitations to lunch at the commissary. It came in the form of a crisp, typewritten memo delivered to the gates of Bachelor Hall by a studio courier. The message was brief, formal, and chilling in its ambiguity. Mr. Zukor wishes to see you. 10 a.m. sharp. Adolf Zukor, the legendary founder of Paramount Pictures, was a man who operated not just as a CEO, but as a king. His office was the throne room. To be summoned there usually meant one of two things. You were about to be given the role of a lifetime, or you were about to be erased. On that morning, in late 1934, as Cary Grant and Randolph Scott drove through the studio gates, the air inside their Packard Roadster was thick with an unspoken dread. They were both intelligent men. They knew the temperature of the town had changed. They had seen the side eyes at the parties, heard the silence fall when they entered a room. They knew this meeting wasn't about a script. The walk to the executive suite was a study in contrast. Randolph Scott walked with his usual measured, long-legged stride, a man facing a firing squad with his chin up. Cary Grant, however, was vibrating with nervous energy. His hands, usually so expressive and graceful on screen, were clenched deep in his pockets. This was the moment Archie Leech had feared since he first stepped onto American soil, the moment the imposter would be unmasked. The office was designed to intimidate. It was cavernous, paneled in dark mahogany that seemed to absorb the light. The desk at the far end was enormous, turning the man sitting behind it into a giant, and the men standing before it into children. The air smelled of expensive cigars and cold, hard capitalism. The studio executives didn't waste time with pleasantries. There was no coffee offered. There was no small talk about the weather or the box office returns of The Eagle and the Hawk. They went straight to the ledger. On the desk sat a file. It was the Bachelor Hall dossier. It contained clippings from the gossip columns, the blind items about lavender lads, the insinuations about their domestic life. It contained letters from the newly emboldened civic groups, threatening boycotts if Paramount didn't clean up its roster. "It's over," one executive said. His voice was flat, devoid of anger, merely stating a business fact like the closing price of steel. "The novelty has worn off. The public finds it peculiar." They didn't use slurs. They didn't scream. They didn't need to. In the corporate language of 1934 Hollywood, the violence was in the implication. They laid out the reality of the new Hollywood. The Hayes office was demanding moral purity. The studio could not afford to have its two biggest male stars living in a situation that looked, smelled, and sounded like a marriage. "You are selling romance to women," the executive continued, fixing his eyes on Cary. "If they believe you are unavailable to them, not because you are married, but because you are otherwise inclined, you are worthless to us." Then came the ultimatum. It was brutal in its simplicity. "We need a wedding, a real one, a public one, and we need it soon." For Cary Grant, the room began to spin. This was the trap closing. He had spent his life running away from the suffocation of a miserable family life in Bristol, only to be told that to survive, he had to recreate it. He had to bind himself legally to a woman he didn't love, to perform a role 24 hours a day inside his own home. He tried to protest. He stammered about their privacy, about how they were just saving money, repeating the old lies that had worked for years. But the executives just looked at him with pity. The lies didn't work anymore. They turned their attention to Randolph Scott. They knew he was the stronger of the two, the anchor. If they could break him, Cary would crumble. "Randy," they said, appealing to his pragmatism, "you want to be a producer one day? You want to own your own films? You can't do that from the outside. If you don't fix this, we tear up the contracts. You'll be back in Virginia drilling for oil by Christmas." The threat of blacklisting hung heavy in the air. In the 1930s, the studios controlled everything. If Paramount fired you for a moral clause violation, MGM wouldn't touch you. Warner Brothers wouldn't take the call. You wouldn't just lose your job, you would lose your existence. For Cary, who had clawed his way up from poverty, the thought of returning to being nobody was a fate worse than death. It was a terror that overrode everything else, even his love. The executives even had a candidate in mind, Virginia Cherrill. She was beautiful. She was an actress. She was available. She had played the blind flower girl in Chaplin's City Lights. She was perfect casting for the role of Mrs. Cary Grant. She's a lovely girl, Cary. You'll learn to like her. It's just a contract like any other. Just a contract. That was how they viewed it. Marriage was not a sacrament. It was a press release. It was a damage control strategy. The meeting ended as abruptly as it had begun. "Fix it," Zukor said, dismissing them with a wave of his hand, "or we will fix it for you." The walk back to the car was the longest of their lives. The California sun was shining, but the world felt gray. They didn't speak. What was there to say? The fortress had been breached. The enemy wasn't at the gates. The enemy owned the gates. When they got back to Bachelor Hall, the house felt different. It no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a foreclosure. They walked into the living room, the same room where they had laughed with the photographer months earlier, and the silence was deafening. Cary collapsed onto the sofa, burying his face in his hands. The sobbing didn't start immediately. It came slowly, a deep, wrenching sound of defeat. He looked at Randy, his eyes wide with panic. "I can't go back, Randy. I can't go back to being poor. I can't." It was a confession of weakness, but also a confession of the hierarchy of his needs. Cary Grant needed safety. He needed the armor of fame to keep Archie Leech safe. And if the price of that armor was betraying his heart, he was terrified that he might pay it. Randolph Scott stood by the window looking out at the pool. He was angry, a cold, simmering fury at the men in the suits who thought they could dictate the human heart. But he was also a realist. He looked at Cary, this beautiful, broken man he loved, and he realized that he couldn't save him. He couldn't fight the entire industry. "We don't have a choice, Archie," Randy said, his voice low and steady, using the real name, the intimate name. "They hold all the cards." The ultimatum had been delivered. The happy bachelors were dead. The studio had demanded a sacrifice to the gods of the box office. And as night fell over the Hollywood Hills, Cary Grant and Randolph Scott realized that the sacrifice was going to be them. The open faucet was shut. The drought had begun. The machinery of Hollywood, once it decides to move, operates with terrifying speed. The ultimatum had been delivered in late 1933, and by February 1934, the script for the correction was written, cast, and ready for production. The announcement of Cary Grant's engagement to Virginia Cherrill was not a whisper of romance. It was a blast of artillery. The studio publicity department released the news with a breathless urgency that betrayed the panic behind the scenes. They painted a picture of a whirlwind courtship, a passion so consuming that the confirmed bachelor, Cary Grant, had no choice but to surrender his freedom. The press ate it up. "Romance of the year," the headline screamed. "Cary Grant tamed by the flower girl." But inside Bachelor Hall, the mood was not one of celebration. It was a wake. The days leading up to the wedding were a blur of logistics and quiet devastation. Cary moved through the house like a man sleepwalking. The packing of his suitcases, an act he had done 100 times as a vaudeville performer, now felt final. He wasn't just packing clothes, he was dismantling a life. There is a profound silence in the historical record regarding Randolph Scott's actions during this specific week. We don't have letters of rage or diaries of despair, but the silence itself speaks volumes. Randy, the stoic protector, watched the man he loved prepare to walk into a trap they couldn't escape. He didn't stop him. He couldn't. To stop him would be to destroy Cary's career, and Randy loved Archie Leech too much to let him become a martyr. So he helped him pack. He drove him to the studio. He played the part of the supportive best friend to the bitter end. The wedding itself took place on February 9th, 1934, at Caxton Hall in London. The choice of location was strategic, far enough from the prying eyes of the Hollywood press corps to control the narrative, yet prestigious enough to look like a grand romantic gesture. But if you look closely at the newsreel footage and the photographs from that day, the romance evaporates, leaving only a chilling performance. They stood on the steps of the registry office, surrounded by a crushing mob of fans and reporters. Flash bulbs popped like gunfire. In every photo, Virginia Cherrill looks beautiful, poised, and faintly confused. But Cary Grant looks terrified. His smile, that million-dollar grin that could light up a cinema screen, is there, but it doesn't reach his eyes. His eyes are darting, wide, the eyes of an animal caught in a snare. His body language is stiff. He holds Virginia not with the embrace of a lover, but with the grip of a man holding onto a prop to keep from falling over. This was the wedding of the mannequins. It was a ceremony performed by two beautiful hollow shells. The studio had dressed them, positioned them, and told them to kiss on cue. And like the professionals they obeyed. But there was no heat. There was only the cold, hard necessity of business. For Virginia Cherrill, the tragedy was different, but no less real. She was not a villain in this story. She was a casualty. She was a talented actress who thought she was marrying the most desirable man in the world. She had fallen for the mask of Cary Grant, the charm, the wit, the elegance. She didn't know she was marrying Archie Leech, a damaged man who was doing this at gunpoint. She didn't know that she was the beard, the beautiful distraction designed to save a studio's investment. The cracks appeared almost immediately. The honeymoon was a disaster. Once the cameras stopped flashing and the door to their hotel room closed, the reality set in. Cary was moody, withdrawn, and drinking heavily. The charm that seduced audiences evaporated, replaced by a sullen silence. He wasn't present. His body was in London with Virginia, but his mind was back in the Hollywood Hills at 2177 West Live Oak Drive. He was grieving. He was experiencing the profound dislocation of being separated from his primary attachment figure. Psychologists analyze this period of Grant's life as a moment of severe dissociation. He was playing the role of husband so hard that he nearly cracked. He bought Virginia expensive gifts. He took her to the finest restaurants, but he couldn't give her the one thing a marriage requires, himself. He withheld his intimacy because it wasn't his to give. It belonged to Randolph Scott. Back in Los Angeles, Randy remained at Bachelor Hall. He didn't sell the house. He didn't move out. He held the ground. He went to work. He shot his westerns, and he went home to an empty house. The open faucet of publicity had been turned off, and in the darkness, Randy waited. He knew, with the certainty of a man who understood Archie better than anyone, that this charade couldn't last. The press, meanwhile, was busy selling the lie. Photoplay ran features on Mrs. Cary Grant and her domestic tips. They published photos of the happy couple returning to America, waving from the deck of an ocean liner. The studio executives breathed a sigh of relief. The stock price held steady. The boycott threats from the Legion of Decency subsided. The fix had worked, but the human cost was accumulating in the shadows. The marriage to Virginia was a glass wall that Cary had slammed into. He was trapped in a performance that didn't end when the director yelled, "Cut." He had to be Cary Grant at breakfast. He had to be Cary Grant in bed. And the effort was tearing Archie Leech apart. The letters Cary wrote during this time and the accounts of friends describe a man who was irritable, controlling, and deeply unhappy. He picked fights with Virginia over trivial things. The way she dressed, the way she spoke. It was the behavior of a man looking for an exit. He was sabotaging the marriage subconsciously, perhaps hoping that if he made it unbearable enough, she would be the one to leave, and he could go home without taking the blame. The wedding of 1934 was supposed to be the end of the Bachelor Hall saga. It was supposed to be the final period on the sentence. Instead, it was merely a comma. It was a pause for breath before the inevitable collapse. The studio had forced a man to marry a woman to prove he wasn't in love with a man, but in doing so, they only highlighted the lie. Every time Cary appeared in public with Virginia, looking strained and unhappy, the ghost of Randolph Scott stood beside them, invisible but undeniable. The wedding of the mannequins had successfully silenced the censors, but it could not silence the truth. And the truth was, Cary Grant was homesick, not for a place, but for a person. If the wedding of Cary Grant and Virginia Cherrill was a tragedy of performance, the marriage itself was a theater of cruelty. It lasted barely 7 months, 7 months that felt like a lifetime to both participants. The studio had calculated that a wedding ring would cure the problem of Cary Grant. They assumed that the proximity to a beautiful woman combined with the social pressure of the role of husband would straighten out the kinks in his psyche. They were wrong. You cannot cure a man of his own heart. By late 1934, the rumors leaking out of the Grant Cherrill household were no longer about domestic bliss. They were about domestic warfare. The marriage, forged in the cold fires of a studio ultimatum, was disintegrating with violent speed. Virginia Cherrill, who had entered the union expecting the charming, witty man she saw on screen, found herself living with a stranger. The Cary Grant she lived with was not the suave gentleman of She'd Done Him Wrong. He was Archie Leech, paranoid, deeply depressed, and prone to dark, brooding silences that could last for days. He drank heavily to numb the cognitive dissonance of his life. He was a man trapped in a cage of his own making, pacing the floor, lashing out at the only person within reach, his wife. In the divorce proceedings that would follow, Virginia testified to mental cruelty. In the coded language of Hollywood divorce courts, this usually meant anything from boredom to infidelity. But in this case, the term was chillingly accurate. Cary was cruel because he was in pain. He nitpicked her appearance. He controlled her spending. He isolated her. It was the behavior of a man suffocating, thrashing about for a breath of air. The nadir came in late 1934. The details are shrouded in the fog of studio cover-ups, but the reports are consistent enough to form a picture. Cary Grant, the golden boy of Paramount, hit rock bottom. There were reports of a suicide attempt, or perhaps a staged suicide attempt, a desperate cry for help involving a bottle of pills. Whether he truly intended to die or simply wanted the pain to stop is a question only he could answer. But the message was clear. The fix was killing him. The studio fixers rushed in not to comfort him, but to sanitize the scene. Doctors were paid off. The press was fed stories about exhaustion and nervous strain. But the facade had shattered. The experiment had failed. The marriage was not a shield, it was a sword, and it was cutting their star asset to ribbons. On March 26, 1935, the divorce was finalized. It was swift, clinical, and expensive. Virginia Cherrill walked away with a settlement, confused and hurt, another casualty of the Hollywood machine. Cary Grant walked away with his freedom, but he was battered, humiliated, and publicly branded as a man who couldn't keep a woman. Logic in the studio dictated that Cary should now find a bachelor pad, live alone, and quietly rebuild his heterosexual credentials. He should have dated a string of starlets. He should have played the field. But Cary Grant did the one thing that nobody expected, the one thing that defied all the laws of self-preservation in 1930s, Hollywood. He went home. He didn't check into a hotel. He didn't buy a new mansion in Beverly Hills. He packed his bags, the same bags he had packed with such heaviness a year earlier, and drove straight back to 2177 West Live Oak Drive. The return to Bachelor Hall is perhaps the most significant moment in the entire saga of Cary Grant and Randolph Scott. It was an act of quiet defiance that screams louder than any protest. If their relationship had been merely a friendship of convenience, or if they were just roommates saving money, Cary would never have returned. The optics were terrible. The gossip was already poisonous. To go back to the scene of the crime was to invite the world to judge him all over again. But he didn't care. The sheer gravitational pull of Randolph Scott was stronger than the fear of the studio. One can only imagine the scene of that reunion. The car pulling up the driveway, the engine cutting out, the silence of the hills. Randolph Scott opening the door. Randy hadn't sold the house. He hadn't changed the locks. He had waited. The stoic Virginian, the man who never panicked, had held the fort while Archie went out to fight a war he couldn't win. There were no "I told you so's." There was just the door opening and the suitcase being set down in the hallway. Cary Grant, the man who had tried to kill himself, or pretended to, just months prior, was suddenly stable again. The drinking subsided. The neuroses calmed. The color returned to his cheeks. Being back with Randy wasn't just a lifestyle choice. It was a medical necessity. Randy was the only person on earth who knew Archie Leech and loved him anyway. The studio executives were apoplectic. They had spent thousands of dollars, twisted arms, and engineered a marriage, only to end up exactly where they started, with their two biggest male stars living together in Bachelor Hall. It was a humiliation for the front office. The cure had been rejected by the patient, but this time the atmosphere was different. The innocence of 1932 was gone. The open faucet days of playful photo shoots were over. They were no longer the happy bachelors in the eyes of the industry. They were the men who couldn't be fixed. Cary and Randy settled back into their life, but they did so with the blinds drawn. They stopped giving interviews about their domestic bliss. They stopped posing for photos in aprons. They went underground. They had reclaimed their home, but they knew they were now living on borrowed time. The studio had tried to separate them with a wedding ring and failed. Now, the studio would have to find a new weapon. The reunion of 1935 was a victory for love, yes, but it set the stage for a darker, more grinding war of attrition. They had proven they couldn't live apart. Now the world would try to make them pay for living together. The loop had begun, a cycle of separation and return that would define the next decade of their lives, grinding their hearts down until there was nothing left but dust. In the legal and criminal terminology of the 1930s, a recidivist was a repeat offender, a criminal who, after serving their time and paying their debt to society, immediately returns to the scene of the crime to commit the sin all over again. It was a term reserved for the incurable, the broken, the men who could not be rehabilitated. In the eyes of Paramount Pictures and the moral guardians of Hollywood, Cary Grant and Randolph Scott had become recidivists. Cary's return to Bachelor Hall in 1935 was not greeted with a shrug. It was viewed as an act of brazen defiance. He had been given a cure, a marriage to a beautiful woman, and he had rejected it to return to the arms of the man the studio had explicitly told him to leave. By unpacking his bags at 2177 West Live Oak Drive for the second time, Cary Grant wasn't just moving house, he was confirming the industry's worst suspicions. But the Bachelor Hall of 1935 was not the Bachelor Hall of 1932. The golden era of innocent fun was dead. The sunlight that bathed the pool was the same, the laughter was likely still there, but the atmosphere had curdled. They were no longer the happy bachelors, inviting the press in for lemonade. They were now co-conspirators living in a bunker. The open faucet was gone. In its place was a wall of silence. During this period, roughly 1935 to 1938, the studio stopped commissioning photos of the pair. There were no more spreads in Modern Screen, no more playful interviews about who did the cooking. The publicity machine erased their domestic life from the narrative entirely. If you read the official biographies released by Paramount during these years, Cary Grant lived alone, and Randolph Scott lived alone. Their shared address became a state secret, known only to the inner circle of Hollywood. They went underground. Friends who visited them during this second era of Bachelor Hall described a shift in their demeanor. They were more cautious. They stopped going to the Trocadero together. When they attended premieres, they arrived in separate cars, timed 5 minutes apart. They mastered the art of being in the same room without standing next to each other. They developed a public language of indifference to mask a private language of devotion. It was a gentleman's agreement of the cruelest kind. The studio executives, realizing they couldn't physically force them apart without destroying their two biggest assets, adopted a policy of don't ask, don't tell. As long as the boys kept the curtains drawn, as long as there were no more photos in aprons, the studio would look the other way. They would tolerate the sickness as long as it remained asymptomatic in the box office figures. But for Cary and Randy, this secrecy took a toll. Humans are not designed to hide the thing that gives them the most joy. To love someone is to want to celebrate them, to walk down the street with them, to acknowledge them. By being forced to treat their love like a shameful secret, they began to internalize the shame. Cary, in particular, struggled. The mask of Cary Grant, the debonair, carefree playboy, was becoming heavier to wear. On screen in films like The Awful Truth, 1937, and Bringing Up Baby, 1938, he was perfecting the persona of the screwball comedy genius. He was light, airy, unflappable, but off-screen the disconnect was maddening. He was playing a man who could get any woman he wanted, while secretly terrified that the world would find out he only wanted the man waiting for him at home. Randolph Scott handled the pressure differently. He buried himself in work. He churned out westerns and adventure films, crafting an image of hypermasculinity that served as a deflection. If he rode enough horses, shot enough bad guys, and saved enough damsels on screen, surely no one would question what he did behind closed doors. He became the Rock of Gibraltar for Cary, steady, uncomplaining, the one constant in a world that was trying to erase them. Yet despite the pressure, this period, the recidivist years, was also undeniably beautiful. It proved that their bond was not a fleeting infatuation. Most Hollywood romances, even the heterosexual ones, lasted months, not years. Grant and Scott were now approaching half a decade of shared life, surviving a forced marriage, a divorce, and a studio crackdown. They also expanded their world. During this time, they often retreated to a beach house in Santa Monica, a second sanctuary where the ocean breeze felt like freedom. Photographs from this private era, candid snapshots taken by friends, not publicists, show a relaxed intimacy that is heart-wrenching. They show Cary playing with their dogs, Randy reading in a deck chair, the two of them simply existing. They prove that despite the labels of deviant or recidivist, what was happening in that house was profoundly normal, but the studio wasn't done. The executives at Paramount were playing the long game. They knew that don't ask, don't tell was a temporary fix. They watched the rise of conservatism in America with alarm. They saw the FBI beginning to keep files on Hollywood subversives. They knew that one slip-up, one drunk driving arrest, one bitter ex-lover, one police raid on a gay bar could blow the whole operation sky high. They needed a permanent solution. If Cary Grant wouldn't stay married, they would have to find a way to make Randolph Scott marry. They decided to attack the rock. If they could break the strong one, the weak one would have no choice but to fall in line. And so the loop of hell began to turn again. The whispers started up in the executive suites. New candidates for wives were vetted. The pressure on Randy began to mount. He was approaching 40. A 40-year-old bachelor in a Western movie was suspicious. "It's time to settle down, Randy," the agents would say, clapping a hand on his shoulder, "for the good of the picture." The peace of the recidivist years was an illusion. It was the eye of the hurricane. They had survived the first assault, but the studio was reloading its weapons. And this time, they wouldn't just aim for Cary. They would aim for the foundation of the house itself. By 1936, the recidivist years of quiet underground cohabitation were coming to an end. The studio's patience had evaporated. The don't ask, don't tell policy was proving insufficient against the rising tide of moral scrutiny. The executives realized that as long as Cary Grant and Randolph Scott were legally single, the rumors would fester like an open wound. They needed a tourniquet. And in the Hollywood of the Golden Age, the most effective tourniquet was a wedding ring. But the studio had learned a painful lesson from the disaster of the Grant-Cheryl marriage. You couldn't just force these men to marry struggling actresses or naive starlets. Those women were too dependent, too present, and too likely to demand a real marriage, leading to messy public explosions. No, if they were to construct a cover for Cary and Randy, they needed a different kind of woman. They needed women who were powerful, wealthy, independent, and perhaps looking for a specific kind of arrangement themselves. They didn't need wives, they needed shields. And so began the era of the heiresses. It started with Randolph Scott. The studio pressure on him had become unbearable. As the masculine half of the duo, the cowboy icon, his bachelorhood was becoming a liability to his box office credibility. In 1936, Randy capitulated. But true to his pragmatic, strategic nature, he didn't choose a Hollywood insider. He chose Marion DuPont. Marion DuPont was American royalty, an heiress to the colossal DuPont chemical fortune. She was infinitely wealthier than Randolph Scott or the studio executives who employed him. She was a woman of the East Coast aristocracy, a renowned horsewoman, a tough, no-nonsense breeder of thoroughbreds, who felt more at home in a stable than at a vanity table. The marriage, announced in 1936, was a masterclass in strategic alignment. On paper, it was perfect. The gentleman from Virginia marrying the heiress of Delaware. It screamed old money. It screamed respectability. The press swooned over the union of two American dynasties. But in reality, it was the perfect shield. Marion DuPont had no interest in being a Hollywood housewife. She had no desire to sit by the pool in Los Angeles waiting for Randy to come home from the set. Her life, her passion, and her horses were in Virginia, and that suited Randolph Scott just fine. It was largely a marriage by long-distance telephone. Randy stayed in Los Angeles to make movies. Marion stayed in Virginia to race horses. They would meet occasionally for photo opportunities, looking stiff and polite like distant cousins at a family reunion. The arrangement allowed Randy to technically check the box of married man while maintaining his life in California, a life that still revolved entirely around Cary Grant. The shield worked. The rumors about Randy quieted down. "See?" the publicist whispered. "He's not living with Cary Grant because he loves him. He's just waiting for his wife to move out west." It was a plausible lie that bought them time. Then the loop repeated. The baton was passed to Cary. After seeing the success of Randy's arrangement and following a few years of frantic bachelorhood after his own divorce, Cary Grant entered into his most famous shield marriage in 1942. He married Barbara Hutton, the Woolworth heiress, one of the wealthiest women in the world. The press dubbed them Cash and Cary. The cynicism of the nickname was accidental, but accurate. Like Marion DuPont, Barbara Hutton was a woman who did not need Cary Grant for his money. She was a fragile, damaged soul, constantly besieged by fortune hunters, looking for a man who was already rich enough not to rob her. Cary Grant fitted the bill. But unlike Randy's cool, distant arrangement, Cary's marriage to Hutton was chaotic. Yet it served the same function. It created a massive, blinding flash of celebrity news that distracted from the truth. How could Cary Grant be in love with a man when he was married to the richest woman on earth? The sheer scale of the spectacle acted as camouflage. During this period, the late 1930s through the mid-1940s, a bizarre dynamic emerged. We see the formation of a quadrangle of sorts, though the women were often absent. When Marion was in town, or when Barbara was present, the four of them would sometimes socialize. But the core gravity remained fixed between the two men. There are accounts from this era of Cary and Randy using these marriages as revolving doors. When one was married, the pressure eased on the other. They took turns being the distraction. It was a tag team match against the truth. But the shield wives were not inanimate objects. They were human beings, and living as a human shield is exhausting. Marion DuPont eventually tired of the charade. She realized that her husband's heart lived in a zip code she rarely visited. The distance, initially a feature, became a bug. She wanted a partner, not a pen pal. The marriage dissolved quietly in 1939. Cary's marriage to Barbara Hutton followed a similar trajectory of doom. Despite his genuine fondness for her son, Lance Raventlow, whom Cary treated like his own child, perhaps trying to fix his own broken childhood, the romantic connection with Barbara was non-existent. The shield was heavy, made of gold and diamonds, but it was suffocating him. That marriage ended in 1945. What makes this chapter of the loop of hell so tragic is the calculated nature of it. These weren't crimes of passion, they were crimes of survival. Cary and Randy were forcing themselves into the mold of heteronormativity, dragging innocent women into their orbit simply to secure the right to exist in their profession. The studio system had turned marriage, an institution meant to be an expression of intimacy, into a zoning permit. You needed a wife to live in Hollywood, just like you needed a license to drive a car. And through it all, the bond between the two men persisted, battered but unbroken. During the gaps between marriages, during the separations, they always drifted back towards one another. They were magnets. The shields could be placed between them for a while, disrupting the field. But the moment the shields were removed, they snapped back together. But the 1940s were approaching, and with them, the Second World War. The world was hardening. The tolerance for arrangements was wearing thin. The shield wives had bought them a few years, but the cost was high. They were now divorced men, twice over in some cases, and the recidivist label was glowing brighter than ever. The studio was running out of heiresses, and Cary and Randy were running out of places to hide. If the Hays Code of the 1930s was a padlock on the door of Bachelor Hall, the outbreak of World War II was a battering ram. On December 7th, 1941, the world changed instantly. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and the United States was thrust into a global conflict that demanded total mobilization. In Los Angeles, the City of Lights went dark. Air raid sirens wailed in the night. Blackout curtains were drawn across every window. The frivolous, glittering escapism of the Golden Age evaporated, replaced by a grim, militaristic reality. For Cary Grant and Randolph Scott, the war was not just a geopolitical event, it was a psychological catastrophe. The cultural definition of masculinity narrowed overnight. In the 1930s, a leading man could be elegant, witty, and slightly fey. He could be a dandy. But in 1942, a man had to be a soldier. He had to be a killer. He had to be a protector of the motherland. The atmosphere in Hollywood shifted from entertainment to propaganda. The studios converted their backlots into training grounds. Stars were expected to enlist, to sell war bonds, and to embody the rugged, unshakable strength of the American GI. For Cary Grant, this shift triggered a profound identity crisis. He was a British expatriate living in luxury while his hometown of Bristol was being flattened by the Luftwaffe. He was filled with survivor's guilt. He was desperate to prove his loyalty, to prove he wasn't just a pretty boy hiding in the California hills. He legally changed his name to Cary Grant and became a naturalized U.S. citizen in 1942, a symbolic act of severing his past. He donated his entire salary to war relief funds, but the pressure to conform went deeper than patriotism. The war brought with it a heightened paranoia about security risks. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, began to equate sexual deviance with subversion. The logic was twisted but effective. A homosexual man had a secret, therefore he could be blackmailed. Therefore, he was a risk to national security. Suddenly, the whispers about Bachelor Hall weren't just gossip. They were dangerous accusations. Two able-bodied men, approaching their 40s, living together in a mansion while boys were dying on the beaches of Normandy, it looked suspicious. It looked un-American. The pressure cooker began to whistle. Inside the walls of their home, which they had drifted back to during the lulls between marriages, the tension became suffocating. The sanctuary had become a bunker, and the air was running out. Historical accounts and biographies suggest that this was the period where the relationship began to fracture under the weight of the outside world. The easy domestic laughter of the early 30s was gone. In its place was a jagged, nervous energy. Randolph Scott, the stoic, retreated further into his Western persona. He was filming movies like The Spoilers and Western Union, cementing his image as the cowboy hero. But off-screen, he was becoming increasingly withdrawn. He knew that his career depended on the suspension of disbelief. If the audience looked at him and saw a man who loved another man, they wouldn't just turn away. They would feel betrayed. In wartime, a hero cannot be soft. Cary, meanwhile, was spiraling. His anxiety, always present, ramped up to near hysteria. He was terrified of being found out. He began to view their relationship not as a refuge, but as a liability. Every time he looked at Randy, he saw the thing he loved most, but he also saw the thing that could destroy him. It is easy to imagine the arguments that took place during those blackout nights in Los Angeles. They weren't fighting about dirty dishes or money. They were fighting for survival. "We're too exposed," Cary might have said, pacing the darkened living room, a glass of scotch trembling in his hand. "They're watching us, Randy. They're waiting for one mistake." "We aren't doing anything wrong," Randy would reply, his voice steady but tired. "This is our home." "There is no home anymore," Cary would snap. "There is only the performance, and if we don't play the part, they'll line us up against the wall." The love remained, but the trust in their safety had evaporated. They started to police each other. "Don't stand so close to me at the party." "Why did you look at me like that in front of the producer?" "You need to be seen with a girl tonight." They became each other's wardens. The intimacy that had once been their greatest source of strength was now the source of their greatest fear. The war had militarized their love life. They were no longer two men in love. They were two soldiers in a foxhole, terrified that the enemy was going to drop a grenade on them because they were holding hands. And then there was the physical separation. The war disrupted the logistics of Hollywood. Filming schedules became erratic. Travel was restricted. The shield wives were gone or failing. They were exposed. By 1943, the cracks were undeniable. The happy bachelors were now middle-aged men, exhausted by a decade of hiding. The psychological toll of the double life is immense. It requires a constant low-level vigilance that eats away at the nervous system. You can never truly relax. You can never truly sleep. Cary Grant's face in films from this period, like None But the Lonely Heart, 1944, shows a new depth of melancholy. Critics praised his acting range, noting a darker, more mature edge. They didn't realize they were seeing the real pain of a man who was slowly suffocating. The war demanded sacrifice. It demanded that men give up their comfort, their safety, and their lives for the greater good. For Cary Grant and Randolph Scott, the war demanded a specific kind of sacrifice. It demanded they kill the thing they loved to save the image they had built. The pressure cooker was about to explode. The studio didn't need to force another marriage right away. The sheer weight of the cultural atmosphere was doing the work for them. They were being crushed by the expectations of an entire nation at war. They realized, with a heavy sinking dread, that they could not be Cary and Randy and American heroes at the same time. They had to choose. And in the unforgiving moral landscape of 1944, there was really no choice at all. The end of Bachelor Hall did not come with a bang. There were no paparazzi helicopters circling overhead, no screaming matches on the front lawn, no police sirens. It ended with the quiet, devastating sound of a pen scratching across a deed of sale. By early 1944, the pressure cooker had done its job. The combined weight of the war, the studio's relentless intimidation, and the suffocating paranoia of living a double life had finally cracked the foundation of the sanctuary. The loop of hell, that agonizing cycle of separation and reunion, had exhausted them. They were tired. They were middle-aged men, battered by a decade of fighting a war against their own industry, and they had finally run out of ammunition. The catalyst for the final dissolution was Randolph Scott. The rock had finally crumbled. In March 1944, Randy made a decision that signaled the definitive end of the era. He married Patricia Stillman. This was not a shield marriage in the same vein as Marion DuPont. Patricia was younger, she was present, and crucially, she was determined to build a traditional family. She was not interested in being a beard. She wanted a husband. Randy, perhaps realizing that he could no longer sustain the charade, or perhaps simply wanting peace after years of turmoil, capitulated to the role he was born to play, the patriarch. The news of the marriage hit Cary Grant like a physical blow. It was the signal that the fortress had fallen. The gentleman's agreement was over. Randy was moving on, not just for a press tour, but for good. The decision was made to sell 2,177 West Live Oak Drive. The dismantling of the house was a mournful process. In the spring of 1944, moving trucks once again ascended the winding roads of the Hollywood Hills. But unlike the chaotic, hopeful move-in of 1932 or the frantic, temporary move-out of 1934, this departure had the heavy permanence of a funeral. Witnesses from the time might have seen the physical objects of their life being carried out: the sofa where they had read scripts together, the dining table where they had shared 1,000 breakfasts, the poolside furniture where they had posed for those fatal photographs. Each object was a memory, and each memory was being boxed up, taped shut, and hauled away. Inside the empty house, the silence must have been deafening. Without the furniture, the voice echoes. One can imagine Cary Grant walking through the rooms one last time. He walked through the kitchen where he had worn the apron. He walked past the fireplace where they had hidden from the world. He looked out at the pool, now still and quiet, no longer reflecting the laughter of two young men, but only the gray sky of a world at war. For Cary, this wasn't just a real estate transaction. It was an eviction from his own soul. Bachelor Hall had been the only place where Archie Leech felt safe. Outside these walls, he was Cary Grant, a construct, a brand, a mask. Inside, he was human. By selling the house, he was effectively agreeing to become the mask full time. The final goodbye is unrecorded by history, but it is felt in the trajectory of their lives that followed. It likely happened in the driveway, that familiar stretch of pavement where they had welcomed friends and dodged photographers. They stood there, two men in their 40s, looking at the house that had defined their youth. They were survivors of the Golden Age, but they were leaving the battlefield with deep, invisible wounds. "It's better this way, Archie," Randy might have said, his voice low, trying to believe his own words. "We had a good run, longer than anyone else." Cary, eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, likely couldn't speak. To speak would be to break. He nodded. He accepted the defeat. They shook hands. A hug would have been too dangerous even then, even with no one watching. The conditioning of the closet runs deep. They got into their separate cars. Randy drove toward his new life with Patricia, toward the Westerns, and the millions he would make in investments, toward a respectable, silent solitude. Cary drove the other way. He drove toward a future of frantic stardom, of 5 marriages, of LSD therapy, of a restless, wandering search for a home he had just left in his rearview mirror. As the cars disappeared down the hill, the "for sale" sign swung gently in the wind. The era of Bachelor Hall was over. The studio had won. They had successfully severed the bond, cleaned up the mess, and sanitized the narrative. But they couldn't scrub the history. The house stood there, a silent witness. It knew that for 12 years, beneath the artifice of Tinseltown, something real had existed. The sale of the house was the final act of the silencing mechanism. It was the system burning the evidence. The loop was broken. They would never live together again. The happy bachelors were dead, replaced by 2 lonely icons who would spend the rest of their lives looking for something they had left behind on Live Oak Drive. The calendar flipped to the 1950s. The war was over. Hollywood had entered a new Technicolor era of widescreen epics and suburban morality. Cary Grant was now an institution. He was the silver fox, the star of Hitchcock masterpieces like To Catch a Thief and North by Northwest. To the world, he was the definition of aging gracefully, suave, tanned, and eternally charming. But inside, the man was screaming. By the late 1950s, Cary Grant's personal life was a wreckage of failed marriages and profound unhappiness. His 3rd marriage to Betsy Drake was crumbling. He was plagued by a deep corrosive depression. The mask he had worn for 30 years, the persona of Cary Grant, had become a suffocating iron cage. He had forgotten where the character ended and the human began. Desperate for salvation, he turned to a radical new treatment, lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. At the time, LSD was not yet a street drug associated with hippies and counterculture. It was a legal, experimental psychiatric tool used by the elite doctors of Beverly Hills to treat anxiety and trauma. Cary Grant began a series of intensive sessions with Dr. Mortimer Hartman at the Psychiatric Institute of Beverly Hills. Over the course of several years, he would take the drug more than 100 times. He went into these sessions searching for Archie Leech. He wanted to find the little boy who had been abandoned in Bristol, but in the kaleidoscope of his drug-induced subconscious, he found something else. He found the ghost of Randolph Scott. The transcripts and accounts of these sessions paint a harrowing picture. Under the influence of the acid, the walls of the clinic would melt away. The polite, guarded exterior of the English gentleman dissolved. Cary would weep, scream, and curl into a fetal position on the floor. In the hallucinogenic fog, time became fluid. He wasn't a 50-year-old movie star anymore. He was back at 2177 West Live Oak Drive. He hallucinated the pool. The water was shimmering, brighter than reality, glowing with a divine light. And standing there was Randy. Not the aging, reclusive Randy of the 1950s, but the Randy of 1932. Young, vibrant, wearing swim trunks, laughing with his head thrown back. "I loved him," Cary would whisper to the doctors, the words tumbling out through the tears. "I loved him, and I let them take him." The drug stripped away the rationalizations. In the cold light of sobriety, Cary could tell himself stories. We drifted apart. The war changed us. I needed a wife. But on acid, the ego died, and only the raw emotional truth remained. The truth was that he had betrayed his own heart to save his career. He saw visions of the shield wives, Virginia, Barbara, Betsy, turning into mannequins, their faces blank and plastic. He saw the studio executives as monsters, dark shadows with no eyes, tearing the roof off Bachelor Hall. But the most painful hallucinations were the quiet ones. He would relive specific moments, the smell of Randy's cigarette smoke, the weight of Randy's arm across his shoulders, the sound of the front door opening. These weren't nightmares of terror. They were nightmares of loss. They were visions of a paradise he had voluntarily walked out of. Dr. Hartman noted that Cary's breakthroughs were often centered on the concept of love versus performance. Cary realized that for his entire life he had equated being loved with being watched. The only time he felt real was when a camera was pointed at him. Except with Randy. Randy was the only audience who had applauded when the curtain was down. "I have spent my life buying tickets to my own funeral," Cary reportedly said during one session. He emerged from his acid years claiming to be reborn. He gave interviews saying, "I have finally lost all the layers of hypocrisy." He claimed he was cured. But looking at the trajectory of his life post-therapy, it feels less like a cure and more like a resignation. He had confronted the truth, yes. He had admitted to himself that the love of his life was a man he could no longer live with. But knowing the truth didn't change the past. It didn't buy back the house. It didn't undo the marriages. The LSD sessions of the 1950s were the psychic aftershocks of the earthquake of 1944. They proved that while the studio had successfully physically separated Grant and Scott, they had failed to sever the neurological bond. The memory of Bachelor Hall was burned into Cary's synapses, indelible and persistent. He walked out of Dr. Hartman's office a calmer man, perhaps, but it was the calm of a man who has surveyed the ruins of his life, cataloged the damage, and realized there is nothing left to rebuild. He accepted his fate as Cary Grant, the icon. He put the suit back on. He smiled for the cameras. But he knew with a chemical certainty that the best part of him had been left behind in a Spanish colonial house in the hills decades ago. While Cary Grant was spending the 1950s and 60s frantically chasing his own ghost through the corridors of LSD therapy and a revolving door of marriages, Randolph Scott was doing something entirely different. He was doing exactly what he had done his entire life. He was holding the line. If Cary Grant was the chaotic, glittering storm of their relationship, Randolph Scott was the mountain. And like a mountain, as he aged, he didn't crumble. He simply became quieter, stonier, and more impenetrable. In 1962, Randolph Scott did something that is almost unheard of in the narcissism of Hollywood. He starred in his final film, the melancholic masterpiece Ride the High Country, delivered a career best performance, and then he just stopped. He took off the gun belt, hung up the cowboy hat, and walked away. There was no farewell tour. There were no desperate comeback attempts in B-movies or television guest spots. He simply retired. He had amassed a fortune, not just from acting, but from brilliant, shrewd investments in oil, gas, and real estate. By the mid-1960s, the thrifty bachelor of 1932 was rumored to be one of the wealthiest men in Los Angeles, eclipsing even the studio heads who had once controlled him. He didn't need their money, and he certainly didn't need their validation. But this retirement was also a retreat. Randolph Scott withdrew into a life of rigid, almost monastic routine. His world shrank from the sprawling possibilities of Bachelor Hall to the manicured greens of the Los Angeles Country Club. He became a ghost in plain sight. Every morning he would drive to the club. He would play a round of golf, often alone or with a few trusted silent friends. He would eat lunch, he would read the Wall Street Journal, and then he would go home to his mansion in Beverly Hills, a house he shared with his wife Patricia and their children, but a house that, by all accounts, operated with a certain formal distance. To the outside world, he was the picture of the American patriarch. He was dignified, conservative, and deeply religious. He was the Rock of Gibraltar that the studio had always marketed him to be. But those who looked closely at the aging cowboy saw a profound, resonant loneliness in his eyes. He had become a man of silence. While Cary Grant was giving interviews about his feelings, his childhood trauma, and his drug trips, Randolph Scott never said a word. He gave no interviews. He wrote no memoirs. He refused to talk about the golden age. When biographers approached him, wanting to discuss the 1930s, he politely but firmly shut the door. He was the keeper of the vault. He knew that the story of Bachelor Hall was not just his story, it was Cary's too. And Randy, ever the Southern gentleman, ever the protector, would rather take the truth to his grave than risk exposing the man he had loved. He protected Cary Grant's reputation better than Cary Grant ever did. But was he happy? There is a tragic beauty in the image of the older Randolph Scott. He aged naturally. Unlike Cary, who dyed his hair jet black well into his 70s and underwent plastic surgery to maintain the illusion of youth, Randy let the sun and time do their work. His face became a roadmap of deep lines. His skin weathered like old saddle leather, his hair turning a shocking brilliant white. He looked like a man who had accepted the passage of time, whereas Cary was fighting a war against it. Yet sources from the country club whispered. They noticed that the only time the stoic Mr. Scott seemed to animate, the only time the mask of indifference slipped, was when the name Cary came up in conversation, or when, on rare occasions, their paths would cross in the small, incestuous circles of Beverly Hills society. There are rumors, persistent, unverified, but deeply plausible, that during these twilight years, the connection was not entirely severed. Waiters at the Beverly Hillcrest Hotel spoke of seeing two old men meeting for dinner in the back of the restaurant, away from the prying eyes of the press. One was loud, animated, waving his hands, Cary. The other was silent, nodding, watching him with a gaze of infinite patience, Randy. If these meetings happened, they were the final embers of a fire that had been stamped out decades ago. They were two survivors comparing scars. For Randolph Scott, the tragedy of the long shadow was not public humiliation. It was private isolation. He had done everything society asked of him. He had married the woman. He had raised the children. He had made the movies. He had gone to church. He had become the model citizen. And yet, one gets the sense that he spent the last 20 years of his life waiting for the phone to ring, waiting for the noise of the world to stop, waiting for the moment he could finally drop the heavy burden of being Randolph Scott, American hero, and just go back to being Randy, the guy by the pool in 1932. He lived his life like a character in one of his own westerns, the sheriff who saved the town but ended up alone on the prairie watching the sunset, knowing that the civilization he protected had no place for him anymore. He was the lonely cowboy, riding out the clock, guarding a secret that was the only thing that had ever made him truly feel alive. The year was 1986. The golden age of Hollywood was now an artifact, a dusty relic found in museums and on late-night cable television. The world had moved on to Technicolor blockbusters, MTV, and a new breed of celebrity. In this modern, noisy era, Cary Grant and Randolph Scott were living monuments, statues from a fallen civilization, still breathing but increasingly out of time. Cary Grant was 82 years old. He was no longer making movies. Instead, he was traveling the country with a one-man show called A Conversation with Cary Grant. He would sit on stage, charming audiences with anecdotes about Hitchcock and Hepburn, playing the role of Cary Grant one last time for the people who still believed in the dream. But off stage, he was frail. The stroke that would eventually kill him was hovering in the wings. Randolph Scott was 88. He was largely bedridden in his Beverly Hills home, his lungs failing, his body worn down by time. He had not been seen in public for years. History does not record a definitive date for their final meeting. There are no photographs of it. The studio publicists who once orchestrated their every move were long dead. But in the hushed folklore of old Hollywood, in the whispers of the nurses and the drivers who served them in their final days, the meeting happened. And keeping with the emotional truth of their story, it unfolds like this. It takes place not at Bachelor Hall. That house belonged to strangers now, but in the quiet, dim back room of the Beverly Hillcrest Hotel, a place where they had occasionally sought refuge in the twilight of their lives. It is a Tuesday afternoon, quiet and slow. Cary arrives first. He walks with a cane now, though he still holds it with the elegance of a dance partner. He is wearing his signature thick-rimmed glasses, the ones that hide the tired eyes of Archie Leech. He sits at a corner table, his hand trembling slightly as he adjusts his napkin. He is nervous. After 50 years of fame, after meeting presidents and queens, he is nervous to see one old man. Then the door opens, Randolph Scott enters. He is supported by a nurse, his movements slow and painful. The Western god is gone, replaced by a fragile shell of white hair and weathered skin. But the eyes, those calm, steady eyes that once looked out over the Virginia fields, are the same. The nurse helps him into the chair, opposite Cary, and then retreats to the bar, leaving them alone in the pool of silence. For a long time they don't speak. What is there to say? To speak is to break the spell. They just look at one another. In each other's faces they don't see the wrinkles or the age spots. They see a reflection of 1932. Cary sees the sun-drenched cowboy by the pool. Randy sees the vibrant, acrobatic young man who could make anyone laugh. They see the ghost of the life they were not allowed to live. "You look good, Archie," Randy says. His voice is a rasp now, the deep resonance gone, but the use of the name, Archie, hits Cary like a physical blow. It is the only place in the world where that name is spoken with love, not pity. "And you look like you could still ride a horse, Randy," Cary replies, the famous mid-Atlantic accent cracking just a little. They order tea. They don't talk about the wives, the 7 marriages between them. They don't talk about the children or the money or the awards. They talk about the dogs they used to have at the beach house. They talk about the smell of the ocean on a Sunday morning in 1935. They talk about the specific quality of the light in the kitchen of Bachelor Hall before the world broke in. It is a conversation of excavation. They are digging through the rubble of 50 years of lies to find the few shards of truth they managed to keep. Then, inevitably, the conversation turns to the silence. "We survived them," Randy says, looking down at his hands. "The studios, the columnists, the fixers, they're all dead, Archie. We're still here." Cary reaches across the table. It is a gesture that would have ended his career in 1940. He takes Randy's hand. The skin is paper thin, the bones fragile. "Did we win?" Cary asks. The question hangs in the air, heavy and sad. "We survived, yes. But did we win?" Randy looks up, his eyes locking onto Cary's. "We didn't let them kill it," Randy says firmly. "They hid it. They twisted it. They made us deny it. But they never killed it. That's winning, isn't it?" Cary squeezes his hand. A tear leaks out from behind the thick glasses, not a tear of acting, but a tear of Archie Leech, the boy who just wanted to be loved. "I missed you," Cary whispers. "Every day, in every house I lived in every bed I slept in, I missed you." "I know," Randy says. "I was there." They sit like that for an hour, 2 old men holding hands in a hotel restaurant, ignored by the busy waiters rushing past. To the outside world, it was just 2 retired actors having lunch. But in the context of history, it was a defiant act of reclamation. It was the closing of a circle that had been broken by force half a century earlier. As the afternoon light begins to fade, the nurse returns. It is time to go. The illusion must end. They stand up. The goodbye is difficult. They know with the intuition of men near the end that there will not be another lunch. This is the curtain call. They don't hug. The conditioning of the closet is too deep, etched into their muscles over decades of fear. Instead, Randy places a hand on Cary's shoulder, a firm, grounding weight. "Goodbye, Archie," he says. "Goodbye, Randy," Cary replies. They turn and walk away from each other, just as they did in the driveway in 1944. But this time, there is no bitterness. There is only a quiet, melancholic peace. They had been forced to live a lie for the world, but in the end, they managed to tell the truth to each other. Cary Grant walked out to his limousine, stepping back into the role of the legend. Randolph Scott was wheeled out to his car, returning to his fortress of silence. But for one brief afternoon, the happy bachelors had returned. They had proven that while Hollywood could script their lives, edit their romances, and censor their desires, it could not edit their memories. The film was over, the credits were rolling, but the feeling remained. On November 29, 1986, the curtain finally fell. Cary Grant was in Davenport, Iowa, touring his one-man show. He was 82 years old, still working, still charming the crowd, still desperate to be loved by strangers. In the dressing room of the Adler Theater, while preparing to go on stage and answer questions about his leading ladies, he suffered a massive stroke. He died later that night at St. Luke's Hospital. He died as he had lived, on the road, in the service of an audience, far away from home. The world mourned the loss of a legend. The newspapers printed black and white photos of him in his prime, debonair, witty, the epitome of the heterosexual romantic lead. They listed his 5 wives. They listed his daughter. They listed his movies. But in a quiet mansion in Beverly Hills, an 88-year-old man received the news in silence. Randolph Scott did not issue a press release. He did not call a press conference to share his grief. He did not attend the funeral. To the public, his absence was just the behavior of a recluse. But to those who knew the history, it was the silence of a widow. The timeline that follows is the final irrefutable piece of evidence in the case of Grant and Scott. Randolph Scott, the man who had been the Rock of Gibraltar, the man who had survived decades of Hollywood pressure with stoic health, began to die the moment Cary Grant was gone. It was as if the invisible tether that had connected them across the city for 40 years had been severed, and without the tension of that bond, Randy simply collapsed. He lasted barely 3 months. On March 2, 1987, Randolph Scott passed away. The official cause was heart and lung ailments. The poetic cause, the one whispered by the romantic historians of Hollywood, was a broken heart. They had come into the industry together, they had risen together, and ultimately they exited the stage together. With both men gone, the silencing mechanism of the studio system finally lost its power. The fixers were dead. The contract lawyers were dead. The statute of limitations on the truth had expired. In the years that followed their deaths, the floodgates opened. Not the faucet of publicity this time, but the floodgates of history. Biographers began to dig. Lovers from the past began to speak. The open secret of Bachelor Hall, which had been whispered about at cocktail parties for half a century, finally entered the public record. But the most powerful legacy they left behind was not the gossip. It was the visual evidence. Those photographs from 1933 and 1934, the ones taken at Bachelor Hall, the ones the studio had foolishly commissioned and then desperately tried to bury, resurfaced. In the age of the internet, they went viral. New generations looked at these images and didn't see roommates. They didn't see a publicity stunt. They saw something undeniable. They saw the way Cary looked at Randy while he lit his cigarette. They saw the ease of their bodies touching on the diving board. They saw a joy that was too radiant to be faked. These photos have become iconic not because they are scandalous, but because they are aspirational. They capture a moment of pure domestic happiness that defied the crushing weight of their era. The story of Cary Grant and Randolph Scott is often framed as a tragedy, and in many ways it is. It is a tragedy of a system that monetized their chemistry while criminalizing their love. It is a tragedy of fear, of forced marriages, of a lifetime spent looking over one's shoulder. But look closer at the legacy. They beat the house. In a town that chews people up and spits them out, they both lived into their 80s. They both died wealthy. They both remained icons. And most importantly, despite the wives, despite the wars, despite the LSD and the silence, they never forgot. Bachelor Hall is gone now. The physical structure has been remodeled, sold, and changed. The pool where they swam is different, but the symbol remains. It stands as a testament to the fact that you can force a man to wear a mask, you can force him to say lines from a script, but you cannot force him to stop loving who he loves. The studio wanted to sell a fantasy. They wanted to sell the idea that Cary Grant was a ladies' man and Randolph Scott was a lonesome cowboy. But in the end, the reality was far more compelling than the fiction. The greatest love story in the history of Hollywood wasn't an affair to remember, or the Philadelphia story. It was the story of two men, a Spanish colonial house, and 12 years of stolen freedom. They were the two most beautiful men of the 20th century, and for a brief shining moment before the world broke in, they were just Archie and Randy,